December 17, 1944. The forests of Belgium near Bastogne. Sergeant Edward Hayes of the 761st Tank Battalion crouched in a frozen foxhole as German artillery shells screamed overhead, each explosion sending frozen earth cascading down on him and his crew. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero, and Hayes could no longer feel his fingers wrapped around his rifle. He had been fighting for 3 days straight without sleep, without hot food, and without any indication that relief was coming. What he believed in that moment was that he and his men would not survive the night. What he could not have known was that a single moment of desperate faith would ripple through an entire battalion and alter the course of an engagement that military historians would study for generations. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how one black sergeant's prayer in the coldest, darkest hour of an offensive transformed not just his own survival, but rekindled the fighting spirit of hundreds of soldiers who had begun to accept defeat as inevitable, proving that sometimes the most profound acts of leadership happen not in moments of strength but in moments of complete surrender. Edward Hayes was 32 years old when he arrived in Europe in October of 1944. He had grown up in rural Georgia, the son of sharecroppers who had taught him two fundamental lessons: work harder than anyone expects and never let them see you break. These principles had carried him through the segregated training camps of Fort Knox, Kentucky, where black tank crews trained separately from white units, using equipment that was often outdated and in disrepair. Despite these obstacles, Hayes had distinguished himself as a natural leader with an intuitive understanding of armored tactics. His commanding officers noted in his file that he possessed an unusual combination of technical skill and the ability to keep men calm under pressure. The 761st Tank Battalion was one of only 2 African-American armored battalions to see combat in the European theater during the entire conflict. They had landed at Omaha Beach on October 10, 1944, more than 4 months after the initial landings, and were immediately thrown into the grinding advance through France. The men of the 761st fought in Shermans, the American medium tank that was reliable, but significantly outgunned by German armor. Each Sherman weighed 33 tons and was powered by a 460 horsepower engine. The main gun was a 75mm cannon that could penetrate about 3 inches of armor at 500 yards. By contrast, the German tanks they faced, particularly the Panthers and Tigers, mounted 88mm guns that could penetrate over 4 inches of armor at twice that distance. Hayes commanded a tank he had named Redeemer. His crew consisted of 4 other men. Corporal James Tucker from Detroit operated the main gun. Private First Class Robert Washington from Philadelphia served as the loader. Private Samuel Brooks from Alabama drove the tank, and Private Willie Jackson from Mississippi handled the bull machine gun. These 5 men had trained together, fought together, and developed the kind of wordless communication that only comes from shared danger. Tucker was the joker of the group, always ready with a story or a song to lighten the mood. Washington was quiet and methodical, the kind of soldier who checked and rechecked every piece of equipment. Brooks had the steadiest hands Hayes had ever seen, able to navigate rough terrain at speed without throwing off the gunner's aim. Jackson was the youngest at only 19 years old, but he had proven himself fearless in their first engagement near the French town of Moyenvic. By December of 1944, the 761st had been in almost continuous action for 2 months. They had supported infantry advances, engaged enemy armor, and provided fire support during the reduction of fortified positions. The battalion had earned a reputation for reliability and courage, though their achievements were rarely mentioned in the news reports that Americans read back home. The media focused almost exclusively on white units, and the heroism of black soldiers often went unrecognized beyond their immediate comrades. The offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge began on December 16th with a massive German assault through the Ardennes forest. The German military leadership had gathered its remaining reserves for one desperate attempt to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. More than 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks crashed into a thinly held section of the American line, The attack achieved complete surprise. In the first 48 hours, German forces advanced up to 20 miles in some sectors, overrunning American positions and creating chaos across the front. The 761st Tank Battalion was attached to the 26th Infantry Division and received orders to move north toward Bastogne on December 17th. Intelligence reports were fragmentary and contradictory. Some said the German advance had been contained. Others suggested that entire American divisions had been surrounded. Hayes and his crew had no way of knowing that they were driving directly into the path of the 5th Panzer Army, one of 3 major German formations committed to the offensive. The column of American tanks and infantry moved through narrow forest roads that were rapidly becoming impassable due to ice and snow. Visibility was less than 50 yards in most places. The temperature continued to drop. Hayes remembered thinking that the cold was more dangerous than the enemy. Men who dismounted from vehicles to relieve themselves risked frostbite within minutes. Weapons malfunctioned as lubricants froze solid. The diesel engines of the Shermans had to be started every 2 hours to prevent the fuel from gelling. On the afternoon of December 17th, Hayes's tank was part of a column approaching a crossroads near the village of Longvilly when German artillery opened fire. The first rounds landed among the infantry soldiers marching alongside the armor. Men scattered into the tree line, seeking any cover available. Hayes immediately ordered his driver to pull off the road and position the tank behind a small rise that offered some protection. Through his periscope, he watched as shells continued to fall with devastating accuracy. The German artillery observers clearly had excellent sight lines on the road. Then the German armor appeared. 3 Panther tanks emerged from the tree line approximately 800 yards away. The Panther was a formidable machine, weighing 45 tons and armed with a long-barreled 75mm gun that was far superior to the Sherman's weapon. Its frontal armor was nearly 5 inches thick, effectively immune to the American gun at any range beyond point blank. The 3 Panthers began engaging the American column systematically, firing with disciplined precision. Hayes knew immediately that they were in a desperate situation. The Shermans could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor except at extremely close range, and closing to that range meant exposing yourself to fire from a gun that could destroy a Sherman with a single hit. He grabbed the radio microphone and called out to the other tank commanders in his platoon. They needed to maneuver, to use terrain and combined fire to create flanking opportunities. But before they could coordinate a response, one of the Panthers fired. The round struck a Sherman 2 positions ahead of Hayes and penetrated the frontal armor. The tank immediately began burning. Hayes watched helplessly as the crew bailed out, 2 men on fire rolling in the snow to extinguish the flames. The American infantry was pinned down by artillery and could not advance to support the tanks. The tank column could not retreat because the narrow road behind them was blocked by vehicles and equipment. They had to fight where they stood. Hayes gave the order to fire. Tucker, his gunner, carefully aimed and fired their 75mm gun at the lead Panther. The round struck the German tank but bounced off the thick frontal armor without penetrating. The Panther immediately turned its turret toward Redeemer. Hayes screamed for Brooks to reverse, and the driver slammed the tank into reverse gear just as the Panther fired. The German shell passed through the space where Redeemer's turret had been only seconds earlier. For the next 20 minutes, the engagement continued with desperate intensity. American tanks tried to maneuver for flank shots, while German armor picked them off one by one. Hayes managed to get his tank into a position where he could fire at the side armor of one Panther. Tucker's shot penetrated, and the German tank stopped moving, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. But the victory was brief. The other 2 Panthers adjusted their positions and began firing at Redeemer. Hayes's driver executed a series of sharp turns, using every dip and fold in the terrain to avoid incoming fire. But they all knew they were only delaying the inevitable. The Sherman was outclassed, and there was nowhere to run. Then, miraculously, American fighter bombers appeared overhead. The weather had briefly cleared enough for air support to reach the battlefield. The German Panthers immediately retreated into the forest, knowing that they were vulnerable to air attack. The immediate threat had passed, but the damage was severe. The American column had lost 6 tanks and more than 30 infantry soldiers. The survivors were shaken, exhausted, and running low on ammunition. Hayes and his crew spent that night in their tank, too exhausted to dig proper defensive positions. They took turns sleeping in 2-hour shifts while one man remained on watch. The temperature dropped even further. Inside the tank, condensation froze on the metal surfaces. The men huddled together for warmth, their breath visible even in the enclosed space. Hayes tried to raise battalion headquarters on the radio, but received only static. They were effectively cut off, with no clear orders and no indication of what was happening around them. December 18th brought more confusion. The column received orders to continue toward Bastogne, then countermanding orders to withdraw to a defensive position, then radio silence. Hayes decided to stay where they were and establish a defensive perimeter. His instinct told him that movement in this chaos would only lead to more casualties. Throughout the day, American soldiers from other units stumbled into their position. Some were from units that had been overrun. Others were simply lost in the forest. Each group brought rumors that contradicted the last. Some said Bastogne had fallen. Others insisted reinforcements were on the way. No one knew the truth. By the evening of December 18th, Hayes had gathered nearly 40 soldiers from various units around his small perimeter. Most were infantry, but there were also some engineers and a few artillerymen who had lost their guns. They looked to Hayes for leadership, because his tank represented the only heavy firepower available. He organized them into watch rotations and had them improve the defensive positions as much as the frozen ground allowed. But he could see the despair in their eyes. These men had been pushed beyond their limits. They were cold, hungry, frightened, and increasingly convinced that they would not survive. Corporal William Bradford, an infantry squad leader from Indiana, spoke to Hayes quietly as darkness fell. Bradford was a 24-year-old veteran who had fought since Normandy. He was not prone to panic or exaggeration, which made his words more disturbing. "Sergeant, the men are talking," Bradford said. "They're saying we should surrender come morning. They figure the Germans will treat prisoners better than this cold will. Some of them can't feel their feet anymore. We've got nothing hot to eat, barely any ammunition, and no idea if anyone even knows we're here." Hayes felt something crack inside him when he heard these words. He had been holding himself together through sheer willpower, refusing to acknowledge his own fear and doubt. But Bradford's statement brought everything crashing down. He realized that he too had been thinking the same thoughts. What was the point of continuing to fight when they were cut off, outnumbered and freezing to death? The rational part of his mind told him that surrender might indeed be the only option that gave these men a chance to see their families again. He walked away from Bradford without responding, moving to the edge of their small perimeter, where his tank sat silent in the darkness. He climbed onto the turret and sat there, looking out at the forest that had become their prison. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional crack of a tree branch snapping under the weight of ice. Hayes thought about his wife, Eleanor, back in Georgia. They had been married for 8 years and had 2 daughters, ages 6 and 4. He had promised Eleanor he would come home. He had promised his daughters he would bring them presents from Europe. Those promises now seemed like cruel lies. For the first time since childhood, Hayes began to pray. It was not the formal, structured prayer of Sunday services. It was desperate and raw. He knelt in the snow beside his tank and spoke aloud to God, not caring if anyone heard him. "Lord, I don't know what to do," he said. "I've got men looking to me for answers, and I don't have any. We're cold and we're scared, and I think we might die out here. I've tried to be strong, tried to do what's right, but I'm empty now. I've got nothing left to give them. So if you're listening, if you care about these men, I need you to show me what to do. Show me how to lead them through this, please." He stayed there, kneeling in the snow, for what might have been 5 minutes or 30. He lost track of time. And then, slowly, something shifted inside him. It was not a voice or a vision or anything dramatic. It was more like a clarification, a sudden understanding of what mattered. He realized that his job was not to guarantee survival or victory. His job was simply to give these men a reason to keep going for one more day, one more hour, one more minute. As long as they kept moving forward, there was hope. The moment they surrendered to despair, they were truly defeated. Hayes stood up and climbed down from the tank. He walked back to where Bradford and several other soldiers were huddled around a small fire they had managed to start using pieces of broken ammunition crates. The men looked up as he approached. their faces gaunt in the flickering light. Hayes stood so they could all see him and began to speak. "I know what you're all thinking," he said. "I've been thinking it too. We're in a bad situation. Maybe the worst situation any of us have been in. And I won't lie to you. Some of us might not make it out of this forest, but I want you to understand something. We are still soldiers of the United States Army. We took an oath. And more than that, we represent something bigger than ourselves. Every one of you black soldiers, you know what I'm talking about. We've had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition. We've had to prove ourselves over and over again. And we're out here in this frozen hell because we chose to serve, even when that service wasn't always appreciated." He paused, watching their faces. He could see that his words were connecting. "So here's what I'm saying. We're not surrendering. Not tomorrow, not the next day. We're going to hold this position, and we're going to keep fighting because that's what we do. And when we get out of this, when we make it home, we're going to be able to look our families in the eye and tell them we never quit. We never gave up. They broke our equipment, they froze us, they scared us, but they couldn't break our spirit." Hayes felt the words flowing now, coming from somewhere deep inside. "I just prayed," he continued, "right over there by my tank. I got down on my knees in the snow and I prayed because I was out of answers. And you know what I realized? We don't need all the answers. We just need to keep faith. Faith in each other, faith in our training, faith that what we're doing matters. So tomorrow morning, when the sun comes up, we're going to improve our positions, we're going to check every weapon and make sure it's ready. We're going to keep watch and stay alert. And if the Germans come, we're going to fight. We're going to fight not because we're sure we'll win, but because that's who we are." The silence that followed was different from the despairing quiet that had hung over the group earlier. Hayes could see men sitting up straighter, could see something rekindling in their eyes. Tucker, his gunner, was the first to speak. "The sergeant's right," he said. "We didn't come all the way across the ocean to quit in some Belgian forest. My mama would whip me if I came home saying I surrendered because I was cold." A few men laughed at that, and the sound was startlingly loud in the frozen night. Other voices joined in. "We've been in tough spots before," someone said. "Remember Moyenvik? They said we couldn't take that town, but we did." Another voice added, "My granddaddy was a slave. He survived worse than this. I can survive this." Hayes felt the energy shifting in the group, but he knew words alone would not sustain them through the coming days. They needed more than inspiration. They needed practical hope, tangible reasons to believe survival was possible. He began moving through the group, talking to each man individually, learning their names, their stories, their fears. There was Private Marcus Johnson from Chicago, who had worked in a steel mill before the conflict, and who now worried that his wife had given birth to their first child while he was overseas. Hayes promised Johnson that they would get home to see that baby. There was Corporal David Mitchell from Mississippi, who had grown up in grinding poverty, but who possessed a natural gift for understanding terrain and defensive positions. Hayes put Mitchell in charge of improving their fortifications. There was Private Henry Coleman from New York City, who had been a jazz musician in Harlem before being drafted. Coleman's hands were so badly frostbitten that he could barely hold his rifle, but he insisted on standing watch. Hayes made sure Coleman got extra time near the fires and wrapped his hands in strips torn from a spare blanket. There was Sergeant First Class Robert Taylor from Texas, a veteran of combat in North Africa, who had more experience than Hayes, but who had been psychologically shattered by the retreat through the Ardennes. Taylor had been sitting in silence for 2 days, barely eating, not speaking. Hayes sat with him for over an hour, talking quietly, drawing him back into engagement with the present moment. Each conversation, each small act of attention and care, strengthened the bonds holding the group together. Hayes understood intuitively what military psychologists would later articulate in formal studies, that unit cohesion under stress depends on personal relationships, not just chain of command. By knowing each man as an individual, by acknowledging their specific fears and strengths, Hayes created a network of mutual responsibility. They fought not just for abstract concepts like duty or country, but for each other, for the specific individuals whose names and stories they knew. The night of December 19th stretched on with excruciating slowness. The temperature dropped to what Hayes estimated was 20 degrees below zero. Men huddled together for warmth, abandoning any concerns about personal space or dignity. Survival required cooperation at the most basic level. Hayes rotated himself through different groups, never staying warm for long, ensuring that his presence was felt throughout the entire perimeter. He checked weapons repeatedly, knowing that the extreme cold could cause malfunctions. He inspected ammunition, sorting rounds to ensure that each fighting position had the right mix of armor-piercing and high-explosive shells for the tank gun, rifle ammunition, and grenades for the infantry. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Hayes was making another circuit of the perimeter when he heard quiet sobbing from one of the foxholes. He approached carefully and found Private Wilson, the young soldier from Ohio, who would later distinguish himself in combat, crying silently. Hayes climbed into the foxhole and sat beside him. For a long moment he said nothing, just sat in the darkness with this frightened young man. Finally, Wilson spoke. "I keep thinking about my mother," he said. "She didn't want me to join. She said she had a bad feeling. And now I'm going to die in this hole, and she was right, and I should have listened." Hayes put his hand on Wilson's shoulder. "Your mother's feeling wasn't about you dying," he said quietly. "It was about you facing something hard. And you are facing something hard. But here's what you need to understand. Your mother raised you to be strong. She raised you to face hard things. And right now, you're proving that she did a good job. You're still here. You're still fighting. That's what she would want to know. Not that you avoided danger, but that you faced it with courage." Wilson was quiet for a moment, then asked, "How do you keep going, Sergeant? How do you not just break down?" Hayes thought carefully before answering. "I did break down," he said. "Tonight, over by my tank, I broke down completely. I prayed because I had nothing else left. And what I learned is that breaking down isn't the same as breaking. When you admit you're scared, when you admit you need help, that's not weakness. That's honesty. And once you're honest about where you are, you can figure out what to do next. I'm not fearless, Wilson. I'm terrified. But I'm also still here. And so are you." They sat together for a while longer, not speaking, just sharing the cold and the darkness and the fear. When Hayes finally climbed out of the foxhole, Wilson said, "Thank you, Sergeant." Hayes nodded and moved on to the next position, carrying his own fear, his own doubt, but also carrying the responsibility for all these men who were looking to him for strength. As dawn approached on December 20th, Hayes gathered his small command group, which now consisted of Bradford, Mitchell, Taylor, who had finally emerged from his psychological retreat, and Tucker. They reviewed their tactical situation with brutal honesty. They had perhaps 2 days of ammunition if they were disciplined in their fire. They had minimal food and no source of resupply. Medical supplies were almost exhausted. The cold was causing more casualties than the enemy. Against this, they had some advantages. Their position, chosen more by accident than design, was actually quite strong defensively. The forest provided concealment. A small stream, now frozen, gave them access to water, and most importantly, they had managed to establish radio contact with higher headquarters, which meant they were no longer isolated. Hayes made assignments based on each man's strengths. Mitchell would oversee the continuous improvement of defensive positions. Bradford would coordinate infantry fire plans. Taylor, drawing on his North African experience, would serve as Hayes's tactical advisor. Tucker would maintain the tank and coordinate its fire with the infantry defense. Each man had clear responsibilities, which gave them focus and purpose beyond mere survival. Hayes felt something he had not felt in days: hope. Not certainty, not confidence, but simple hope that they could endure. He organized the men into work details. Some would gather more wood for fires, staying close to the perimeter. Others would inventory their ammunition and weapons. Everyone would have a task, something to focus on besides fear and cold. Activity was better than despair. Throughout that night, Hayes moved from position to position, talking with small groups of soldiers, checking on their condition, sharing what little food they had. He made sure everyone knew that he was there, that he was sharing the same risks and hardships. Leadership, he understood, was not about having all the answers. It was about being present in the struggle. December 19th brought a development that would prove crucial. A patrol from a nearby American unit made contact with Hayes's group. They brought limited supplies and, more importantly, information. The situation was indeed dire but not hopeless. Bastogne was surrounded but still holding out. The entire Third Army under General George Patton was driving north to break the encirclement. If they could hold for a few more days, relief would come. Hayes's small group was now part of a broader defensive line that was forming to contain the German advance. With this information, Hayes organized his mixed group of soldiers into a more coherent defensive position. The single Sherman tank became the anchor of their line. The infantry dug in on both flanks, creating interlocking fields of fire. The engineers used their expertise to create obstacles and improve the fighting positions. What had been a collection of desperate survivors became a functioning military unit. On December 20th, German infantry probed their position. It was not a major assault, just reconnaissance in force, testing the American defenses. Hayes's men fought with a determination that surprised even themselves. They had gone from considering surrender to actively seeking engagement. The prayer in the mud, the speech by the fire, the individual connections Hayes had forged, had fundamentally changed their psychological state. They were no longer victims waiting for the inevitable. They were soldiers with a mission. The probe began around 10 o'clock in the morning with mortar fire. Hayes had positioned observation posts forward of the main line, and they provided early warning. The mortars fell in a pattern that suggested the Germans were trying to locate the American positions precisely. Hayes ordered his men to hold fire, not wanting to reveal their positions prematurely. This discipline, this willingness to endure indirect fire without responding, was itself a mark of how far the group had come. 2 days earlier, these same men had been on the verge of panic. Now they lay in their positions, enduring the explosions, trusting their leadership and their fortifications. After 20 minutes of mortar fire, German infantry appeared, moving cautiously through the forest in squad-sized elements. They were approximately 200 yards away when Mitchell, who had the sharpest eyes in the unit, spotted them. He quietly passed word to Hayes, who moved to a position where he could observe. The German soldiers were well trained, moving with tactical discipline, using cover effectively. Hayes estimated there were perhaps 40 to 50 of them, probing across a front of about 300 yards. Hayes waited until the German soldiers were within 100 yards before giving the order to fire. The sudden volume of fire from concealed positions shocked the German troops. Several went down immediately. The rest sought cover and began returning fire, but they were at a significant disadvantage. Hayes had positioned his forces in depth with interlocking fields of fire, and the Germans were caught in a kill zone with limited cover. The engagement lasted only about 15 minutes before the German force withdrew, leaving several casualties behind. What was remarkable was not just that Hayes's group had repelled the probe, but how they had done it. The fire discipline was excellent. Soldiers aimed carefully, conserving ammunition. The tank held its fire entirely, not wanting to reveal its position unless necessary. Different positions supported each other, with some providing covering fire while others repositioned. This was not the panicked, disorganized defense of a desperate group. This was controlled, professional military action. After the German forces withdrew, Hayes organized patrols to check the area where the fighting had occurred. They found 3 German soldiers who had been wounded but left behind when their unit retreated. This presented Hayes with a decision that would reveal much about his character and values. The wounded Germans were clearly in bad shape. One had a leg wound that was bleeding severely. Another had taken shrapnel in the abdomen. The third had a head wound and was barely conscious. Hayes could have left them to die. Many commanders would have, given the scarcity of medical supplies and the fact that treating enemy wounded would deplete resources needed for his own men. Instead, Hayes ordered that the German soldiers be brought into the American perimeter and given medical treatment. Corporal Thomas Green, who had worked as a medical orderly before the conflict, protested. "Sarge, we barely have enough supplies for our own guys," Green said. "Why should we waste them on Germans?" Hayes's response was immediate and firm. "Because they're human beings who are hurt, and we can help them. That's all the reason we need. If helping them means we run short later, we'll deal with that when it happens, but I won't let men bleed to death when we can prevent it." This decision had a profound impact on the morale and character of Hayes's unit. It reinforced that they were not fighting out of hatred or a desire for revenge. They were fighting because it was their duty, but they could still maintain their humanity. Several of the soldiers helped treat the wounded Germans, sharing their own sparse medical supplies and water. One of the wounded German soldiers, who spoke some English, asked Hayes why they were helping him. Hayes simply said, "Because that's who we are." The German probe was repelled with minimal American casualties. More importantly, the fight revealed that Hayes's group occupied a position of tactical significance. They were blocking a secondary road that the German forces wanted to use for moving supplies forward. Intelligence gathered from the wounded German soldiers, who were willing to talk in exchange for medical care, confirmed that additional German forces were in the area and would likely attempt to seize the position in the coming days. Over the next 2 days, the German pressure increased. Artillery fire became more frequent. Infantry attacks became more determined. But each time Hayes and his men held. The Sherman tank proved invaluable, its 75mm gun breaking up German infantry formations before they could close with the American positions. The period from December 21st through December 22nd was marked by a strange combination of intense combat and equally intense boredom. The Germans would probe, they would be repulsed. Then there would be hours of waiting in the cold, waiting for the next attack, waiting for relief, waiting for orders that might never come. During these waiting periods, the soldiers talked, and in talking, they built bonds that would last for the rest of their lives. Private Johnson, the steel worker from Chicago, talked about his wife, Margaret, and their neighborhood on the South Side, where everyone knew everyone and looked out for each other. He described how he had proposed to her at a church picnic, how nervous he had been, how she had laughed and cried at the same time when she said yes. Listening to Johnson talk, the other soldiers could picture this life he had left behind, this world he was fighting to return to. His stories made the abstract concept of home concrete and real. Corporal Mitchell shared stories about growing up in rural Mississippi, about learning to hunt and fish before he could read, about the incredible poverty, but also the strong community bonds that had sustained his family through hardships. He talked about his grandmother, who had been born into slavery and who had lived to see her grandson become a soldier fighting in Europe. "She told me before I left," Mitchell said, "that every generation has to fight its own battles. Hers fought slavery. My daddy's generation fought Jim Crow and poverty. Now it's my turn. And she said to make sure I fought with honor, because how I fought would matter as much as whether I won." Tucker, the gunner who kept everyone's spirits up with his humor, revealed a more serious side during these long conversations. He had wanted to be a musician, had even played trumpet in a band in Detroit before being drafted. He talked about the music scene, about the clubs where black musicians created something new and vital, about how music could express things that words could not. "When we get back," Tucker said, "I'm going to write a song about this, about the cold and the fear and the way we held together. People need to know what happened here. They need to know what we did." Washington, the quiet loader, rarely initiated conversations, but would contribute thoughtfully when others were talking. He had been studying to be a teacher before the conflict, and he had a reflective, analytical mind. During one long night watch, he talked with Hayes about what it meant to be a black soldier, fighting for a country that did not fully recognize your humanity. "My daddy fought in the First World War," Washington said. "He came back thinking things would change, that service would earn respect. But nothing changed. Same discrimination, same violence, same exclusion, and yet here I am, 25 years later, doing the same thing. Sometimes I wonder if we're fools." Hayes thought carefully before responding. "Maybe we are fools," he said. "Or maybe we're fighting for something bigger than what exists right now. We're fighting for what should be. Every time we do our jobs well, every time we prove ourselves under fire, we make it a little harder for them to deny our humanity. It's not enough. It's not fair that we have to prove what should be self-evident. But it's what we can do right now in this moment. And maybe, if enough of us do it well enough, the next generation won't have to fight the same battles your daddy fought." Brooks, the driver, was the most taciturn of Hayes's original crew, but during these days he opened up about his family's farm in Alabama, about the back-breaking work of tenant farming, about his determination to find a different life after the conflict. He had mechanical skills that had gotten him assigned as a tank driver, and he dreamed of opening his own garage back home. "I can fix anything," he said with quiet pride. "Give me tools and time and I can make it work. That's got to be worth something in the world, right? A man who can fix things?" Jackson, the youngest, talked about his mother, who had raised 5 children alone after his father died. She worked as a domestic servant for a white family, and Jackson described her dignity and strength, even in circumstances that were designed to be degrading. "She used to tell me," Jackson said, "that how you do things matters more than what you're doing. She said even if you're doing work that society doesn't respect, you can still do it with pride and skill. She said that's how you maintain your self-respect in a world that doesn't want to give it to you." These conversations, shared during breaks between combat, during watch rotations, during the long cold nights, created a shared narrative that bound the group together. They were not just a collection of individuals thrown together by military necessity. They were a community with shared values, shared struggles, shared hopes. Hayes listened to all of these stories, remembered them, used them to understand each man better and to know how best to lead them. The German attacks continued with increasing intensity. On December 21st, a company strength force, perhaps 120 soldiers, made a coordinated assault from 2 directions. This was far more serious than the probe of the previous day. Hayes recognized immediately that they were in danger of being overrun. He called for artillery support from the radio, but the officer on the other end said support was not available. All available artillery was committed elsewhere. They would have to hold on their own. The attack came in the late afternoon, just as light was beginning to fade. German soldiers, moving in squad rushes and providing covering fire for each other, advanced through the forest. Hayes waited until they were within 75 yards before ordering his tank to open fire. Tucker's first shot was high explosive. Set to airburst above the advancing infantry, the shell detonated 20 feet above the ground, sending shrapnel down on the German soldiers. Men fell, others went to ground. Before they could recover, the American infantry opened fire from their concealed positions. The volume of fire was intense but controlled. Each American soldier picked targets, fired aimed shots, conserved ammunition. Hayes moved along the line, calling out encouragements, directing fire to areas where German pressure was heaviest. Mitchell coordinated the left flank defense, ensuring that the Germans could not infiltrate through a gap in the tree line. Bradford held the right flank where the terrain was more open and the German advance was more organized. Tucker fired the 75mm gun repeatedly, switching between high explosive and canister rounds depending on the range and concentration of German forces. Washington kept up a steady pace of loading, his movements efficient despite the fatigue and cold. Brooks positioned the tank multiple times, backing it into cover after each shot to avoid giving the German forces a stationary target. Jackson fired his bow machine gun in short, controlled bursts, aiming at muzzle flashes in the gathering darkness. The fight lasted nearly an hour. In that hour, Hayes's group expended almost half their remaining ammunition. But they held. The German force, after taking significant casualties and failing to break through the American line, withdrew as darkness fell completely. Hayes organized immediate after-action procedures. Ammunition was redistributed to ensure each position had sufficient rounds. Casualties were treated. 3 American soldiers had been wounded, none critically. Defensive positions that had been damaged by German fire were repaired. Most importantly, Hayes moved through the entire perimeter, checking on each soldier, ensuring they knew they had performed well, that their defense had been successful. That night, December 21st into December 22nd, was perhaps the coldest yet. The temperature dropped below -20. Men who fell asleep risked never waking up. Hayes instituted a system where everyone had a buddy who was responsible for checking on them every 30 minutes. Sleep became a luxury measured in minutes rather than hours. Yet the men endured. They had proven to themselves that they could fight effectively. They had held against a significant German attack. Pride in their performance sustained them through the physical misery. Tucker, the gunner, developed an almost supernatural ability to estimate range and trajectory in the difficult terrain. Washington, the loader, could reload the main gun in under 7 seconds, well above the standard training time. Brooks, the driver, learned to position the tank to take advantage of every piece of cover while maintaining clear fields of fire. Jackson, the bow gunner, became expert at identifying threats in the forest and suppressing them before they could develop. But it was not just Hayes's crew that was performing exceptionally. The entire mixed group of soldiers had bonded into an effective fighting unit. Corporal Bradford, the infantry squad leader who had initially talked about surrender, became Hayes's most trusted subordinate, coordinating the infantry defense with skill and courage. A young private named Thomas Wilson from Ohio, who had been nearly catatonic with fear on December 18th, distinguished himself by crawling forward under fire to recover wounded men from exposed positions. The weather remained brutally cold. Soldiers learned to sleep in shifts inside the few vehicles available, rotating so everyone got at least a brief respite from the freezing temperatures. They melted snow for drinking water and ate their rations cold because fires during daylight would draw artillery. Frostbite casualties began to mount, but the men treated even this as a challenge to overcome rather than a reason to give up. On December 22nd, the weather finally cleared enough for sustained air operations. American fighter bombers appeared in force, attacking German supply columns and artillery positions. The psychological impact on Hayes's group was immense. They were not forgotten. They were not alone. Help was coming. The appearance of American aircraft in the skies above the frozen forest did more for morale than any speech could have accomplished. That same day, Hayes received a radio message from his battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel John Bates. The 761st Tank Battalion had been fighting across multiple locations, and Bates had been trying to maintain contact with all his scattered units. When he learned that Hayes had not only survived, but had organized a defensive position that was holding against German pressure, Bates was astounded. "Sergeant Hayes, what you've done is remarkable," Bates said over the crackling radio. "You've held a position that higher headquarters thought we'd lost days ago. The information you're providing about enemy movements is invaluable. I need you to hold for 2 more days. Can you do that?" Hayes looked around at his men, at their determined faces, at the positions they had improved and defended. "Yes, sir," he replied. "We can hold." Those 2 days were among the longest of Hayes's life. The German forces, realizing they were running out of time before American reinforcements arrived, increased their attacks. On December 23rd, a company-strength German infantry force, supported by 2 self-propelled guns, made a determined assault on Hayes's position. The fighting was intense and close range. At one point, German soldiers got within 30 yards of the American lines before being driven back by concentrated fire. Tucker fired 47 rounds from the main gun that day, more than double the normal combat expenditure. The barrel became so hot that it glowed visibly even in daylight. Washington's hands were blistered from handling the hot shell casings, but he never slowed his loading pace. Brooks maneuvered the tank repeatedly to unmask different firing positions, exposing himself to enemy fire each time he repositioned. Jackson expended over 2,000 rounds from his machine gun, and his shoulders were black with bruises from the weapon's recoil. The infantry fought with equal determination. Bradford's squad held the left flank against multiple German attempts to infiltrate through the forest. Wilson, the young private who had overcome his fear, single-handedly eliminated a German machine gun position that was threatening to enfilade the American line. By the end of the day, Hayes's group had held, but ammunition was critically low. They were down to less than 20 rounds for the tank's main gun, and an average of only 2 magazines per rifleman. That night, as the men tended their wounds and tried to rest, Hayes again found himself standing alone beside his tank. He thought back to the prayer he had offered 5 days earlier. He had asked for guidance on how to lead these men, and he felt that prayer had been answered, not with divine intervention that removed their danger, but with the strength to endure it. He understood now that faith was not about guaranteed outcomes. It was about maintaining hope and purpose in the face of uncertainty. December 24th brought the sound they had been waiting for. Artillery fire, but coming from the south, directed at German positions. The Third Army was breaking through. By midday, advanced elements of American armor from the 4th Armored Division made contact with Hayes's position. The relief force commander, a captain whose name Hayes never learned, stared in amazement at the defensive position. "We expected to find wreckage, maybe some survivors hiding in the woods," the captain said. "Instead, we find a fortified position that looks like it could hold for another week. How did you pull this off?" Hayes looked at his men, at their exhausted, frost-bitten but unbroken faces. "We just decided not to quit," he said simply. The liberation of Bastogne came on December 26th, and Hayes's group was among the units that participated in the breakout. The 761st Tank Battalion was consolidated and continued to fight through the remainder of the Bulge campaign. They participated in the reduction of German positions throughout January and into February of 1945. The battalion's performance during the entire offensive earned them a Distinguished Unit Citation, one of the highest honors that could be awarded to a military unit. Hayes himself was recommended for the Silver Star for his leadership during those critical days in December. The citation specifically noted his ability to organize scattered units, maintain defensive positions against superior forces, and inspire soldiers who had reached the point of despair. The medal was presented to him in a ceremony in March of 1945. More meaningful to Hayes were the letters he received from the men he had led. Bradford wrote, "You saved my life, Sarge, but not in the way you might think. You didn't save me from the Germans. You saved me from giving up on myself." Wilson wrote, "I was ready to die in that forest, not from enemy fire but from surrendering to fear. You showed me I was stronger than I knew." The story of Hayes's prayer and the subsequent holding action became known throughout the 92nd Infantry Division, to which the 761st Tank Battalion was attached for part of the campaign. It became an example used in training and in maintaining morale during difficult periods. The chaplain of the division, Captain Thomas Morrison, wrote about it in his memoir, describing it as one of the most powerful examples of faith under pressure he had witnessed during the entire conflict. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the broader perception of black combat units. The performance of the 761st Tank Battalion, and particularly Hayes's leadership during the Bulge, contributed to the growing body of evidence that contradicted the racist assumptions that had led to segregation in the military. Military leaders who had previously doubted the combat effectiveness of black soldiers had to confront undeniable proof of their courage and capability. While full integration of the armed forces would not come until President Truman's executive order in 1948, the groundwork was being laid by men like Hayes and the soldiers he led. After the conflict ended in May of 1945, Hayes returned to Georgia. He was reunited with Eleanor and his daughters in a moment that he would describe as the happiest of his life. He found it difficult to talk about his experiences. The memories were too fresh, too intense. But gradually, over months and years, he began to share the story with his family and community. He always emphasized that the real heroes were all the men who had held that position, not just him. But those who heard him speak understood that his leadership had been the catalyst that transformed despair into determination. Hayes remained in the army after the conflict, serving through the integration of the armed forces and eventually retiring as a master sergeant in 1958. He had served for 20 years, seeing the military transform from a segregated institution into one that, while still imperfect, offered opportunities based on merit rather than race. He often said that the prayer in the mud during those dark December days had changed not just that one engagement, but the entire trajectory of his life. It had shown him that leadership was not about being fearless or having all the answers. It was about being present in the struggle and helping others find their own strength. In 1963, Hayes was invited to speak at a ceremony commemorating the Battle of the Bulge. By then, he was a respected member of his community, known for his work with young people and veterans. In his speech, he returned to the theme that had defined his experience. "Faith," he said, "is not the absence of fear or doubt. Faith is choosing to move forward despite fear and doubt. In that frozen forest in December of 1944, I had every reason to give up. We all did. But in a moment of complete surrender, when I admitted I had no answers and no strength left, I found something deeper. I found the understanding that we are capable of more than we know, but only if we refuse to accept defeat. The speech was recorded and later archived at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Historians who have studied the Battle of the Bulge often point to Hayes's unit as an example of how small unit leadership can have disproportionate impact on larger operations. By holding a position that higher headquarters thought was lost, Hayes's group provided crucial intelligence about German movements and denied the enemy use of a key supply route during the critical phase of the offensive. In the larger strategic picture, their contribution was modest. But in the human story of courage and perseverance, their example was profound. Tucker, Hayes's gunner, remained a close friend for life. They would visit each other regularly, and Tucker always insisted that Hayes saved his life. "Not from the Germans," Tucker would say, echoing Bradford's words, "You saved me from myself. I was ready to quit, and you showed me I didn't have to." Washington, the loader, became a teacher after the conflict, and often used the story in his classroom to illustrate lessons about perseverance and character. Brooks, the driver, returned to his family farm in Alabama and raised 6 children, all of whom heard the story of December 1944 multiple times. Jackson, the youngest crew member, struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress, but found support from his fellow veterans and eventually found peace through work in his church. The Sherman tank that Hayes had named Redeemer survived the conflict and was eventually returned to the United States. It sat in a scrapyard for years before being rescued by a group of veterans and restored. Today, it is displayed at the Fort Knox Armor Museum, with a plaque telling the story of Sergeant Edward Hayes and his crew. Visitors can read about how this particular tank, crewed by 5 black soldiers, held a defensive position against overwhelming odds during one of the most critical battles in American military history. Hayes lived to see many changes in American society. He witnessed the civil rights movement, the integration of schools, and the gradual, difficult progress toward racial equality. When asked how his military service influenced his views on these social changes, he always gave the same answer. In that forest, when everything was falling apart, the color of a man's skin didn't matter. What mattered was whether he would stand with you or run, whether he would do his job or quit. I learned that courage and character are not distributed according to race. They are human qualities that we all possess if we choose to access them. Everything I've done since the conflict has been informed by that lesson. The last reunion of the 761st Tank Battalion was held in 1992. By then, Hayes was 79 years old. Only a handful of veterans from the battalion were still alive and able to attend. They gathered in a hotel conference room in Washington, elderly men with white hair and weathered faces, greeting each other with the easy affection of brothers. They shared memories, looked at old photographs, and toasted absent friends. At the end of the evening, they asked Hayes to say a few words. He stood leaning on a cane and looked at the faces around him. "When I think about what we did," he said, "I'm not most proud of the position we held or the Germans we stopped. I'm most proud of the moment when we chose not to give up. That moment when we were cold and scared and thought we might not survive, but decided to keep fighting anyway. That moment defined us, and I hope it defines all of us for the rest of our lives." Hayes passed away in 1997 at the age of 84. His funeral was attended by family, friends, veterans, and community members whose lives he had touched. The eulogy was delivered by Wilson, the young private who had overcome his fear during the Bulge and who had become a successful attorney. "Sergeant Hayes taught me the most important lesson I ever learned," Wilson said. "He taught me that in our darkest moments, when we think we have nothing left to give, that's when we discover our true strength. Not by denying our fear or despair, but by acknowledging it and choosing to move forward anyway." He prayed in the mud because he had reached the end of himself, and in that moment of honest surrender, he found the strength to lead all of us out of despair. That is his legacy. Not medals or citations, but the example of how to live with courage and integrity even when everything seems lost. The story of Edward Hayes and his prayer in the mud has been told and retold in various forms over the decades since the events of December 1944. It appears in histories of the Battle of the Bulge, in studies of African American military service, in discussions of leadership under extreme pressure. Each telling emphasizes different aspects, but all return to the central truth. that in a moment of complete vulnerability, when a man admitted he had no answers and sought help beyond himself, he found the clarity and strength to lead others through their darkest hour. The broader historical significance of Hayes's story extends beyond the immediate military context. It represents a particular American narrative, the story of people who have been marginalized and underestimated, proving their worth through actions rather than words. The 761st Tank Battalion, like other black combat units, fought against two enemies during the conflict. They fought the German military, and they fought the prejudice and discrimination that suggested they were not capable of doing so effectively. Their performance, exemplified by Hayes's leadership during the Bulge, was part of the foundation upon which later civil rights victories were built. Military historians have noted that the integration of the American armed forces, which began officially in 1948 but took years to implement fully, was made possible in part by the undeniable combat record of segregated black units during the Second World War. When proponents of continued segregation argued that integration would harm military effectiveness, supporters of integration could point to units like the 761st Tank Battalion and say, "These soldiers fought with distinction under the same conditions as white units. The evidence does not support your claims." Hayes and men like him were not consciously fighting for integration or civil rights in that frozen forest. They were simply trying to survive and do their duty. But their actions had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The psychological transformation that Hayes underwent during those December days also represents something universal in human experience. The moment when we reach the absolute limit of our resources and either break or discover unexpected reserves of strength is a defining moment that many people experience in various forms throughout their lives. It might come in response to physical danger, as it did for Hayes. It might come in response to grief, illness, financial disaster, or any of the other challenges that human beings face. The lesson of Hayes's story is not that prayer will magically solve problems, but that in moments of honest acknowledgement of our limitations, we sometimes find clarity about what truly matters and what we are capable of enduring. The practical impact of Hayes's leadership on that specific engagement was measurable. By holding the position, his group prevented German use of a supply route, provided intelligence on enemy movements, and contributed to the overall defensive effort that eventually contained and reversed the German offensive. But the psychological impact on the men he led was equally important. Soldiers who had been on the verge of surrender found reasons to continue fighting. Men who had felt forgotten and abandoned discovered they were part of something larger than themselves. That transformation, from despair to determination, was the real victory that Hayes achieved. In the decades since the events of December 1944, psychologists and historians have studied the factors that allow individuals and groups to maintain effectiveness under extreme stress. Hayes's experience illustrates several key principles. First, honest acknowledgement of fear and doubt, rather than denial, can be the foundation for genuine courage. Hayes did not pretend to be unafraid. He admitted his limitations openly, first to himself in prayer, and then to his men in his speech. This honesty created trust and allowed others to acknowledge their own fears without shame. Second, providing people with a sense of purpose beyond immediate survival can sustain them through extraordinary hardship. Hayes gave his men a narrative that connected their suffering to larger values, their identity as soldiers, their determination to prove themselves, their refusal to quit. Third, visible leadership, the physical presence of a leader sharing the same risks and hardships, creates bonds that can overcome despair. The prayer itself, the catalyst for Hayes's transformation, was neither eloquent nor theologically sophisticated. It was a simple, desperate cry for help from a man who had reached the end of his own resources. But in that simplicity was its power. Hayes was not performing for an audience or trying to manipulate God. He was honestly acknowledging his need, and in that acknowledgement he found clarity. The clarity was not a promise of survival or victory. It was an understanding of his role. To give his men reasons to continue for one more day, one more hour, one more minute. As long as they kept moving forward, there was hope. This understanding allowed Hayes to function effectively, even in circumstances that seemed hopeless. He could not guarantee that they would be rescued. He could not promise that they would all survive, but he could give them tasks, purposes, reasons to get up and keep going. And as they did so, as they improved positions, checked weapons, stood watch, they gradually transformed from victims into agents. They were no longer simply enduring what was happening to them. They were actively engaged in their own survival. That psychological shift, from passive suffering to active engagement, was the difference between breakdown and perseverance. The men who served with Hayes during those days spoke about the experience for the rest of their lives. Some struggled with the memories, the cold, the fear, the loss of friends. These left scars that time never completely healed. But all of them also spoke about the pride they felt in having endured. They had been tested in the most extreme circumstances imaginable and had not broken. They had looked at defeat and death and said, "No, we will continue." That experience shaped their entire lives afterward. They knew with absolute certainty that they could endure hardship because they had already done so. They knew they could rely on their comrades because they had already done so. They knew that despair could be overcome because they had already overcome it. Hayes himself remained humble about his role. He consistently deflected credit, insisting that he had simply done what any sergeant would have done, that the real heroes were all the men who had fought and held. But those who had been there knew better. They understood that leadership, real leadership, is not about dramatic gestures or inspiring speeches. It is about being present in the struggle and helping others find their own strength. Hayes had done that in the most desperate circumstances imaginable, and in doing so, he had changed not just the outcome of a single engagement, but the lives of everyone who served with him. The broader lesson, the one that extends beyond military history to universal human experience, is that transformation often comes in moments of complete surrender. When we reach the point where we acknowledge that we have no answers, no strength, no resources left, that is often when we discover unexpected possibilities, not because surrender brings magical solutions, but because honest acknowledgement of limitations allows us to see clearly what truly matters and what we are actually capable of doing. Hayes thought he had nothing left to give his men, but in admitting that limitation, he found clarity about what he could still do: be present, share the struggle, and help them find their own reasons to continue. That was enough. Not enough to guarantee success, but enough to make success possible. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.